Okay, in this session we're going to talk about the whole issue of canon. And this is another topic like contradictions or apparent contradictions that you will hear a lot about, not probably as much as contradictions, but it is a topic that is often talked about, and you need to know what's going on and have some basic answers. I tell the story in the book of a friend. I had to change all their names. I don't know what I changed it to, but we'll call him Tom. It was a friend of mine. He was active in Campus Crusade for Christ, back when it was called that. He was the head of the Baptist Student Union, navigators, one of these guys that was really, really busy. And he started missing our weekly meetings. And then he stopped coming to some of the classes we had together, and then he just dropped out entirely, and I couldn't find him. And about 5 months later, I ran into him, and we talked, and I said, "So, what happened?" He said, "Oh, I'm not sure I believe that any stuff anymore, because, after all, we don't really have the right books in the Bible. Good ones were left out, bad ones are included, and you can't really trust it." Now, I am sure that there were other issues in his life that were leading him to that, but some teacher at Western Kentucky University used the issue of canon to destroy this kid's faith. And other people are doing the same thing. So we need to really talk about, not text criticism. Sorry. Canon. There we go. I need to talk about the issue of canonicity. So the challenge is simply that we don't have the right books in the Bible. Good ones were left out. Bad ones were included. So let's talk about definitions before we go much further. The word canon refers to a standard, a measuring rule. What is used to determine what is true and what is false? That's a kind of a non-biblical, non-technical definition. So a canon is how do you decide what is true? You compare it to the canon. So we have what's called the process of canonicity, which is the process of how did we get the 27 books we have in our Bible? How did those 27 books come to be viewed as canonical? Okay, so canon is the standard of truth. Canonicity is the process of deciding what books belong in there. And there's three groupings of books. There is an Old Testament Apocrypha, and these are the books that are in the Catholic Old Testament that are not in the Protestant Old Testament. And we might be able to get to talk about that. The New Testament Apocrypha are another collection of books that claim to be, and generally are, Christian, but they were written a little bit later than the rest of the New Testament, and the church never accepted these books as being canonical. But some of these are pretty interesting. We get history from First Clement. We find they're fun books to read, but we would never derive our theology from them because they were not part of the canon. And then there's another group of books called the New Testament pseudepigrapha, and these pseudepigrapha means false writings. And these are the whack-out loony bin books. I mean, they're just nuts. Did you know that Jesus was out helping Joseph build a table for a rich man, a bed for a rich man, and Joseph messed up, and he cut one of the beams too short, and he was all upset about it, and Jesus said, "Don't worry about it, Dad. Just you grab that end, I'll grab this end, and I'll stretch it out for you." So he stretched out the beam, and so Joseph was able to make a bed. Yeah. Those are the kinds of stories. And another one where Jesus was playing upstairs, and a little boy fell out of an upstairs window and died, and everyone ran home and to tell his folks that Jesus had pushed this boy out and had killed him. And Joseph heard about it, and, "Why did you push that boy out?" And Jesus said, "I didn't push the boy out." And so to prove his point, he raised the little boy up from the dead. Say, "Did I push you out of the window?" And the little boy said, "No." There's infancy narratives. There's, like the Gospel of Peter. There's the Gospel of Philip. There's the Gospel of Nicodemus. I mean, these books are all in the New Testament pseudepigrapha. No one really has ever seriously considered any of those books. But there are some books in the New Testament Apocrypha that the early church kind of, well, is this canonical or is this not? But those are the groupings. So Old Testament Apocrypha, Catholic Bible, not in Protestants. New Testament Apocrypha, interesting, helpful books, not canonical. New Testament pseudepigrapha, nuts. Okay, a theological term. All right, first question. Someone comes to you and says, we should put books in the Bible that aren't there, or there's ones that we should leave out. In other words, they're going to raise the question of canon. The first question that you ask is, well, which ones do you want to exclude? Which books in the Bible don't belong? I mean, what you'll find is that there are people that don't like a verse here and a verse there. But they'll think about it, and generally they won't have a book. Now, I was watching a YouTube video the other day, and there was some guy that was arguing an old liberal theory about what books Paul supposedly did and didn't write, and he actually knew. And there are people that argue that Ephesians should not have been included. And the problem is the book, when Paul wrote it, it's written, well, whoever wrote the book of Ephesians, they would say, he doesn't know the Ephesian church. In fact, he actually says he hasn't seen them. And so obviously Paul spent 3.5 years in Ephesus, so obviously he could not have written Ephesians. And there's good counter arguments to it, the main one being that he's not writing just to Ephesus, but to that whole area, the southwest part of Asia Minor, of which Ephesus was the main city. And so while it's addressed to the Ephesians, that it really was intended for that whole area, and Paul hadn't met a lot of the people in that area. But some people will say Ephesians doesn't belong. Some people say the pastorals don't belong. And in my commentary, I spent 150 really boring pages arguing why Paul certainly did write the Pastoral Epistles. So there might be some people that know some of the problems, but for the most part, they won't know. You say, well, if you think we got the wrong books of the Bible, which ones do you want to cut out? And why? The second question is just the reverse. Well, what books do you want to include? Well, I don't know, there were a lot of books out there, and they got left out. They shouldn't have been left out. Well, which ones? And again, like in so many of these questions, they won't know. That's going to tell you whether they have a serious question or not. All right? Now, the main one you will hear is the Gospel of Thomas. And I'm going to talk about that in about 20 minutes. But that'll be the main book that they want to include in the canon. If somebody says, good books were left out, well, which one? Oh, Gospel of Thomas. Here's your comeback. Have you read it? Be sure to ask him that question. Because I know of no one other than extremely liberal scholars that have read it who thinks Thomas actually wrote it. And I'm going to show you a passage that'll convince you that there's no way Thomas wrote it. But if they say, Gospel of Thomas should have been included, ask them if they've read it. I'll guarantee you they haven't. Because any normal person that reads the Gospel of Thomas knows it's not authentic. Okay, so those are the questions. I don't trust the Bible because they got the wrong books. Well, which one should be left out? Which one should be included? If it's the Gospel of Thomas, have you read it? Okay, that's your sequencing of questions, okay? Now let me fill that out. And let me start with a few facts. Number one, the Da Vinci Code is fiction. He says it in the preface. This is fiction. Craig Blomberg told me the story that his daughter came home from college once, and her history teacher was quoting the Da Vinci Code as an historical document. Yeah, and so you'll get this a lot. And Brown is tricky because he says it's fiction at the beginning, but then when you are starting to read, he talks like it's fact. And I think it's very interesting that probably the best director in Hollywood today, Ron Howard, and certainly the best actor today, Tom Hanks, made a movie on the Da Vinci Code that was a complete flop. There's something else going on in that scenario, and I don't know what it is, but I get a big kick out of it. Because anything Ron Howard does or anything that Tom Hanks does great, right? Except this one book, this one movie. So, the Da Vinci Code is fiction. It's fiction. It's all made up. That's really important because most people that want to talk about Constantine and Canon and Gospel of Thomas are coming off of the Da Vinci Code. Estimates are that 1 out of 4 Americans read the Da Vinci Code. Okay, so incredibly powerful book. I wish mine would sell a 10th that well. Number 2, Constantine and the Council of Nicaea. There's all kinds of myths around this. Constantine did call a council in Nicaea, hence the Council of Nicaea, and what he was concerned about was the Arians. Arians taught that Jesus was not fully God, and the Arians were teaching that, and it was splitting Constantine's kingdom. And it was a purely political concern. He didn't want his kingdom split, so he called the Council of Nicaea to resolve this issue. He did not participate. We have the documents. We know what happened. He did not participate in the Council of Nicaea. Neither did his mommy. Oh, Constantine's mom invented the doctrine of the Trinity. Didn't you know that? Brown actually says that Constantine created the doctrine of the Trinity, if my memory serves. He had nothing to do with the council other than calling it. So what happened, a lot of the leaders came in from all around the world, including Arius, and they did not create the doctrine of the Trinity. So if you hear someone say the doctrine of Trinity was created in Nicaea, it was not. They didn't even talk about the Trinity. What they talked about was the relationship of Jesus to God. What was the relationship? And the Nicene Creed that comes out of it is their verbiage for the relationship between God the Son and God the Father. Now, the way the doctrine of the Trinity came about is that you started with monotheism, God the Father, and then came to the awareness that Jesus was also God and yet distinct from God. And once you have Jesus being God, it was an easy step for the Holy Spirit, another comforter, as Jesus says, to also be God. And that's how the doctrine of the Trinity developed. So Nicaea did talk about the relationship of God the Son to God the Father, but it did not talk about the Trinity. Okay, very important that you understand that. And all that Nicaea did was affirm a long-held belief in the divinity of Christ. It wasn't created, it was affirmed. You feel the difference? It's not anew. Now, if you read Bart Ehrman and some of these other people, they will talk about that there are all these competing orthodoxies, and that some people held to the divinity of Christ, some people held to the Trinity, and other people didn't, and they got together and they duked it out in Nicaea, and what we call orthodoxy won out, and that's not the case. All that the Council of Nicaea did was affirm a long-held belief in the divinity of Christ. Okay, so no Trinity in Nicaea. And also, they didn't even talk about the canon. I mean, how many times have you heard people talk about the canon being created in Nicaea? Have you come across that? It's a very common thing that people say. Yeah, it wasn't the church that decided the canon. It was just a bunch of stagio theologians held up in Nicaea working with Constantine and his mommy, and they decided what 27 books belonged in the Bible. And that's 100% wrong. They never even talked about canon in Nicaea. In fact, there never was a council to talk about canon until the Council of Trent that officially made the Old Testament Apocrypha part of the Catholic Bible. And that was in the 1500s. So nice. So these are and these are historical, verifiable facts. There's no question. But the only reason we have to say that is because of Dan Brown's playing with language, okay? So the Da Vinci Code is fiction. Constantine called the Council of Nicaea to deal with Arianism. They affirmed a long-held belief in the divinity of Christ that developed into a doctrine of the Trinity, and they never talked about canon. Okay? So those are the facts. We'll go from there. Why is there a canon? Why did we even need to come up with, and again, I'm talking exclusively now about the New Testament canon. Why did we need to have an authoritative list of books for the church? Why did the canon ever occur? It occurred for three reasons. One is the death of the apostles. As long as the apostles were around, as long as the eyewitnesses of Jesus were around, people could go to them and say, hey, did Jesus teach this? And then when, so there's ways to verify the gospel story. But the disciples started to die. Okay, Peter, Mark, Paul, all under Nero around 67. John was in the 90s. I don't know when tradition says Matthew and Luke died, but it was later. But they did die, and so the authoritative voice was dropping out of the church. So they had to decide of all the books that are written, and there were a lot of books written, right? Paul talks about letters that are written in his name that aren't true. Tells the Thessalonians, you may have heard, tells the Galatians the same thing. You may have heard that there's this letter from me saying the day of the Lord has already come. It's not true. So there were a lot of false writings floating around, which is actually point 3. There were heretical or false writings, and the church had to decide which ones were authoritative and which ones not. The other thing that caused the creation of the canon was the persecution. Now, it really wasn't until Diocletian that it became a capital offense to own a Bible in the beginning of the 2nd century. But if you're going to be persecuted for your faith, you need to know what your faith is. So if someone comes to you and say, deny that Jesus is the Messiah, is the Christ, is God. Okay, do I believe that? Yes. Okay. And then you get your head cut off or something. You don't want to die or be persecuted for something that actually isn't biblical, something that isn't Christian. And so because of the persecution, there's a real need to make sure to define clearly what they believed about Jesus. So you have the death of the authoritative disciples, you have the pressure brought by persecution, and you have all these false writings, letters and whatnot floating around. So the church had to come up with some way to say, these are the books that we accept as authoritative. Okay? All right. So what was the criteria? Unfortunately, this isn't written down anywhere. It's not like somebody made a list and say, here are the 3 things that you have to have in order to be considered a canonical book. But as you look at the writings, especially of Eusebius, and you see what was going on, there are certain patterns that emerge, certain things that the early church was looking for. And certainly the single most important was apostolicity. Who wrote it? Because the church understood the apostles spoke with the authority of Christ, and therefore their writings carried the authority of Christ. So if the book was written by an apostle, it was accepted almost instantly as authoritative, as what we would call part of the canon. And we have to expand it a little for Luke. So we say the books had to be written by an apostle or a friend of an apostle. Luke's 27% of the New Testament, so you've got to get him in there. And again, like I said, I think I said it the other day, it's really amazing. There's not that much controversy around Luke, and yet you'd think he'd be the one they would go after, being a Gentile, not having eyewitness. But most of the attacks are on Matthew, Mark, and John. But anyway, apostolicity understands that the author had to be an apostle or a friend of an apostle carrying the authority of Christ. This certainly explains why Hebrews had trouble getting into the canon. I'm going to tell you the books, 5 or so that had trouble getting into the canon. Hebrews had trouble getting into the canon because they didn't know who wrote it. And it's always fun to read, I think it was this, I think it was that. Right now, the current going theory is Priscilla. There's zero evidence of who wrote it. People are just making things up, I think, because they want a woman writing a book in the New Testament. But there's zero evidence who wrote Ephesians. Certainly wasn't Paul. I mean, the language, the grammar, the vocabulary, the way of thinking is not how Paul speaks and thinks. But it is interesting. The church in the East When we say the church in the West, we mean Rome. So the church in the East is Constantinople, in that area. They taught that Paul did write Hebrews in order to get it into the canon. And so, I think people overall knew that Paul didn't write Ephesians, but it did struggle to get into that. So I guess under apostolicity, you'd almost have to have a caveat for Hebrews. But anyway, it did struggle to get into the canon. None of these books struggled very long. Not until by the middle of the 2nd century, the struggle was all done. But it did struggle. 2 Peter struggled to get in. Now, it says that it's written by Peter, who wrote 1 Peter, who was one of the inner three, the head of the Jewish church. And the problem is the Greek of 2 Peter is horrid Greek. It's so obvious that whoever wrote 2 Peter did not write 1 Peter. I mean, it's just night and day different. And so people struggled with 2 Peter, and also because most of Jude is in 2 Peter, right? There's more in 2 Peter than there is in Jude, but because of the overlap, it was kind of a question mark. The answer simply is that Peter had a amanuensis, he had a secretary who wrote for him. And the Greek of 1 Peter is very good. I suspect Peter himself wrote 2 Peter because it's someone who doesn't have command of the Greek language. It's awkward. It's just weird. But it had trouble getting into the canon because it looked like Peter didn't write it. The church finally decided that Peter did write it, included in the canon. And the other book that had trouble getting into the canon was Jude. Partly because Jude is contained in 2 Peter, and that didn't make any sense. But mostly because Jude quotes two non-biblical characters. Enoch and who was the other one? Anyway, he quotes two people that are not in the first century arena of Christianity. And I go, why is a Christian book quoting non-Christian people who aren't in the Old Testament either? It's not the Enoch in the Old Testament, it's another Enoch. But eventually people decided, no, even though this is kind of weird and different, Jude was Jesus' brother, and he was there. He wasn't an apostle, but he was certainly part of the early church, and because we know who wrote it, we should accept it. So those are the books that struggle on the issue of authorship. Okay? All right. The second criteria is, I didn't realize I had that, sorry, was orthodoxy. Does it agree? Does this book agree? Now, here's what's important. 22 of the 27 books of the New Testament were accepted as authoritative instantly. When Matthew wrote, people accepted it as being an authoritative book. When Paul wrote Romans, people accepted the book as authoritative. Yeah, there were people in Corinth that didn't like Paul. There were people in Galatia that didn't like Paul. I mean, there was argument and stuff going on. But when you talk about the church as a whole, there was no question that Paul wrote Romans, and Romans was authoritative. It was a standard for belief and practice. And so you have, by the end of the first century, you have 22 books that function as what we call the core of the canon. And so when you talk about orthodoxy, you have to have something to compare these books to. And so what they did was they compared these books to the 22 books that were accepted as orthodox and authoritative. Just so you know, sometimes people talk about 21 books in the core. Revelation raised some eyebrows just because it's so different. But it's kind of in reverse. Revelation was accepted as authoritative right away. It wasn't until later, I think at the end of the second, beginning of third, when Dr. Kruger gets here, he knows all these numbers. Okay, he is the guy on Canon. So that's my main source. But he goes with 21 books in the core canon. But Revelation was accepted as authoritative right away. And later on, people kind of questioned it, but then they came around saying, well, John wrote it, so we have to believe it. So I talk about 22 books. Now, the book that struggled to get into the canon because of this issue was, what book seems to disagree with Paul? James. This was James' trouble. The quoting of Genesis, the example of Abraham, and justification by works, not by faith. So they've already accepted the core belief that justification is by faith. And then James comes along and says justification is by works. And I mentioned this earlier. So James actually had trouble getting into the canon, but again, James is Jesus' brother. And that carried a lot of weight, and eventually the book was accepted. Perhaps not by, well, I would say except not by Luther, who called it a right strawy epistle, an epistle made out of straw. But the reason Luther left it in the canon was because he believed James wrote it. So the authorship is a really big deal. But orthodoxy was the second criteria. The book had to agree with the doctrines that they had already accepted. And the third is Catholicity. Now, that doesn't mean they're part of the Roman Catholic Church. Catholicity is, in the creed, I believe in the Catholic Church. Do you say that creed here at all? I believe in God the Father, Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. It goes on. I believe in the Catholic Church. I went to a Lutheran school, 7th and 8th grade, and I get that we said that every day in chapel, and I get up. I don't believe in the Catholic Church, I'm Protestant. Well, that's not, the word means universal. And so Catholicity asks the question, what did the church as a whole accept as authoritative? It's really important because sometimes when you hear this debated, people will say, well, a few scholars off in some corner in Nicaea made the decision. The answer is no, they didn't. The church as a whole made the decision, and people like Origen actually traveled from city to city to city. What books do you accept? What books do you, he talks about this, you can read it. What books do you accept? What books do you accept? And if a book was not viewed by the church as a whole as authoritative, it had real trouble getting into the canon. Philemon had trouble getting into the canon. Why? Because it's a short little book to one man, right? And unless you're really interested in the issue of slavery or manipulation on Paul's part, I mean, Paul is being so highly manipulative in a shame culture that it's just really interesting to read Philemon. But it was a small book written to one man, and do you know what I just meant? There is shame in every verse in Philemon. Count it to my account to accept him back. Of course, you owe me everything. That's what the whole book of Philemon. I don't think Paul trusted Philemon. And he was afraid of sending Onesimus back and having him be killed because he was a runaway slave. And so there's just all kinds of manipulation, shame-based manipulation all the way through the book. But anyway, it's a small book written to one person, and it's obviously that a lot of people had not read it. It wasn't distributed across the ancient world. 2nd and 3rd John, likewise, had trouble getting into the canon because they're short letters written to one church. But eventually, over time, and again, not that long, you're into the 2nd century probably, Philemon, 2nd and 3rd John was accepted. Those were the only books that were questioned. And that's really important because when you hear this, when was the canon created? It was 396 or 356 or some such number. And it gives the impression like the church struggled for over 300 years to decide which books they thought were from God. And that's simply not the case. The decision was made almost instantly because they knew Paul wrote Romans. They knew Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. And they knew James wrote his book. And so the acceptance of the core canon was very, very quick by the church as a whole. Okay, do those three criteria make sense? Okay. Oh yeah, by the way, there never was a council called to decide on the issue of canon. There never was a meeting of the church leaders to decide these 27 and no others. The only council that was ever called specifically to deal with the issue of canon was the Council of Trent in 1527. I'm not good on dates. To authoritatively state that the Old Testament Apocrypha belongs in the Bible because the Reformers had kicked it out. That's the only council there is. So there never was a meeting of leaders to decide this issue. It was the church as a whole. So if you take that, let's talk about the Gospel of Thomas. We'll use this as a test case, all right? So the book is called the Gospel of Thomas. It's a misnomer. It's not a gospel. It's 114 sayings. There's no narrative. There's no story of Jesus' life. No accounting of miracles, fulfillment of prophecy, death and resurrection. None of that's in there. Okay, it's just 114 sayings. It was discovered in Egypt at a place called Nag Hammadi. So it's called the Nag Hammadi Library. It was discovered in 1945, so relatively recently. Relatively recently in archaeological terms. It's all written in Coptic, the language of northern Egypt. It's not written in Greek. And it is written by a group of people called Gnostics. The Gnostics were labeled as heretics very early on. They had a whole range of beliefs that were antithetical to Christianity, and it's very clear that they were not Christians. And when they dated the Gospel of Thomas, by however archaeologists date things, carbon dating, what coins are present, what's the kind of script that was used. They have a whole series of ways to identify the age of these things. They dated Gospel of Thomas about 175 to 180. Some people want to push it as early as 140. It doesn't really matter. The standard is 175 to 180. So that's what the Gospel of Thomas is. Discovered in 45, written in Coptic. It's heretical, and it was written at the end of the 2nd century. So take that, and let's apply the 3 criteria. Does it pass the test of apostolicity? Well, if Thomas had written it, sure. But according to very solid tradition, Thomas took off and went to the southeastern part of India, where his influence is still felt today, by the way. Southwestern part of India, a highly Christianized area. And my Indian friends tell me the government actually sends people to it saying, why do you treat people so well? How do you take care of people the way you do? And it's their Christian heritage that came from Thomas. And it's a very solid historical tradition. But Thomas didn't live 180 years. So there's no way that Thomas wrote it. So it fails the test, the most important test of apostolicity. Well, what about orthodoxy? Well, it's heretical. And I'm going to show you an example in a second. It's pure heresy. It's Gnosticism in its worst form. And no one in the 1st or 2nd century, in this case, would have ever thought that this was an agreement with Paul. And in terms of Catholicity, because it was discovered in 1945, it does not pass the test of Catholicity because the church didn't know about it. This is the writing of a small sect of Egyptian Gnostics kind of huddled up in Nag Hammadi somewhere, who wrote this 150 years after the time of Christ. So it fails at every single test of canonicity. And if that's not enough, here's the last saying. And it's great that it's the last saying, because if you talk to people and say, well, have you read it? Oh, yeah, I've read it. Well, what do you think about the last saying? Here's the last saying. Read it for yourself. Now, that's called misogyny. Simon Peter said to the other apostles, make Mary leave us. Get her out. For females don't deserve life. Sorry, Jesus never said this. Jesus said, look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit. So because she's a woman, she's not a living spirit. Resembling you males, for every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, does anybody think that should be in the Bible? And yet, the Jesus Seminar said that the Gospel of Thomas was more historically accurate than I think it was the Gospel of John. So, when somebody says, well, yeah, you should have included the Gospel of Thomas. First question, have you read it? Number 2, why do you think it should be included? Was it written by an apostle? No. Is it orthodox in its teaching? No. Was it viewed by the church as a whole? No. Have you read the last saying? And I have a hard time believing anyone in the real world, outside the academy, would actually think Peter would say that, or Jesus would say that. Now, there are other sayings just as wacko, but this is one of the wackoest, craziest sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. So that's the Gospel of Thomas, and it's all this stuff that's gone on about the Gospel of Thomas needing to be in the Bible, but it's by people who have never read it. That's why it's so important to ask if they've read it. Okay? All right. Now, let me clarify something, and Dr. Kruger, this is right out of his stuff, and he will really emphasize it carefully. The church does not declare something to be canonical. It's very, very important. Because if the church decided if the formal structure of the church passed a pronouncement, okay, we have decided this book is canonical, then there's something over the gospel. But nothing can be over the gospel. The gospel is over the church. And Kruger will do a really good job saying that the church doesn't bestow canonicity, it recognizes it. And that's the distinction. What did the universal church recognize to be inherently divine, inherently authoritative? They recognized the 27 books that we have in the New Testament. So the church doesn't make the decision in the sense of an institution sitting down and voting with their colored beads or whatever. The church as a whole recognized that the power of the Spirit was working in these 27 books. So again, just a reminder, these are the core books that were accepted, that were understood to be divinely, inherently authoritative from God. All four Gospels, it's really interesting, the four Gospels went straight through. There's virtually no debate on the Gospels. Acts, Paul's 13 epistles, 1 Peter, 1 John, and I put Revelation in this category. I think that's where it belongs, but Dr. Kruger knows a lot more than I do about canon. And so, in deference to him, there's at least 21. These became the standard by which all the other books were judged, okay? And again, the really important thing is that it didn't take 300 years for the church to make this decision. These decisions were made very, very quickly. So when the issue of canonicity comes up, you want to ask, have you read the book that you want to include in the Bible? And does it pass the 3 tests? Okay? I don't have slides for some of these things, but let me. Pardon? Was I 4, 5, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 20. Oh, look at that. That's 21. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd. My goodness, that's an error in my book. You'd think I could count. 4. Okay, Paul 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. That's an error in my book. Shoot. Why didn't the editor catch that? That's his fault. Thank you for pointing that out. Thank you for being able to add. Why did I do that? I remember debating whether to say 21 or 22 the whole time I was writing. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. Pardon? The book does say 21? Okay. Oh, cool. That's okay. Thank you. I feel a lot better about myself. My oral tradition is not as effective as the first century church. I don't even remember what I wrote. One of the things I had to deal with when I wrote the commentary on the pastorals was the whole idea of pseudepigraphy, of people writing under someone else's name. And the argument is that the church was willing to accept books written under another author's name. And it's one of these crazy things in the academy that gets passed around without any evidence. In fact, the only evidence to the contrary is that if they knew the book was a forgery, it was cut out. So there was remember how Paul says in Colossians 4:16, when you're done reading this, read the letter I wrote to the Laodiceans. Well, guess what? A letter to the Laodiceans showed up. But what's called the Muratorian Canon said, it's okay to read it, but it's not scripture since it wasn't written, quote, in our time. In other words, they recognized that this particular book was a false letter. Paul never wrote it. And he didn't write it because Paul had been dead by the time it was written. In other words, they knew it was a forgery and they got rid of it. There used to be a book, well, it's still called 3 Corinthians, that supposedly a bishop wrote it out of love, quote unquote, for Paul. So there were forgeries, but when the church found out about the book and that it was a forgery, not only did they tell people not to read it, but they kicked the man out of his ecclesiastical position because it was a forgery. We're not going to read forgeries. And there was another, and I think it's the Gospel of Peter. Serapion says this book wasn't handed down to us. It wasn't written in the first century. Perhaps the most important point is to know is that the church cared. This was not a willy-nilly thing. They cared about what books should be in the canon, which books they should see as authoritative. And if they knew it was not written by the person who claimed to write it, they threw it out. So the church was very careful on this, as you would expect from people being persecuted. And especially in Diocletian's time, even possessing a Bible was a capital offense. So they were very, very careful. I'm sorry, Mark. How long are we supposed to go to? Just.
You can go anytime. Just again, if you're done, we can wrap up.
Well, there's other things I can say about Canon.
You've got technically until 2:30, so you got plenty of time to do whatever you want.
Okay, all right. Let me cover there'll be some other questions that I know you're going to ask, so let me head them off. One of the most common questions is when was the canon closed? In other words, when was all debate done? And the 27 books were set. And again, this is an important question because if it truly took the church till 367 AD, then it could not have been clear to them which books were from God. So the idea of the closing the canon is an important question. And Kruger has championed a threefold definition of canon, which I'm sure he'll talk about when he comes, that there is the ontological canon. Ontology has to do with how do you know something. And what he's saying is that when you talk about the canon closing, the canon for a book was closed the minute the book was written. In other words, the minute that Paul wrote the book to the letter to the Romans and sent it, that part of the canon was closed. He wrote the book. He's an apostle. He carries Jesus' authority. There's no question that belongs in the Bible. That's what he means by ontological. And so he will stress when he comes that these books were accepted, except for just a few. These books were accepted instantly. And that's very important. You listen to people like Bart Ehrman, we'll talk about next session, and they want to talk about competing orthodoxies, and there is this school of thought and this school of thought, and only the ones that had Constantine's ear won or something like that. And it just took the church a long time to decide what books are authoritative, and that's just not true. The 21 books were all accepted instantly because they recognized him. He has another definition of what he means by canon. It's called the functional canon. And he will date this about the middle of the 2nd century. And what he'll say is, when did the church have a basic collection of 27 books that functioned in an authoritative way? In other words, when was there a collection of books that, for the most part, even though there was some debate about some of the things on the edges, for the most part, they had a collection of books that people could cite as authoritative. He calls that the functional canon, and he dates that the middle of the 2nd century. So while there was some debate about 2nd and 3rd John and 2nd Peter and Hebrews and James, that for the most part, the people understood by the middle of the 2nd century, we can appeal to because here's a fascinating chapter on the codex. This is a codex, right? Up until this time, everything was scrolls. It appears that the Christians invented the codex. Now, scrolls continue to be used, but Christians quickly switched to a codex where it's cut and bound. Why do you think the Christians went to a codex? Yeah, it's canon. How do you decide what books are authoritative? Well, let's put them all in one place. Because as long as they were scrolls, they were just sitting in there with other books. But when you create a codex, you're saying these are the 27. And it's interesting, we don't have a single codex that has anything but the 27 books. So the codex was a really important invention. It's also a lot easier to scroll than carry than 27 scrolls. But anyway, he'll say that. The third definition of canon he calls the exclusive canon. And this is when was all debate ended? When did the church just stop talking? Now, there were people up in the 5th and 6th century that did, but for the most part, when did all discussion of what books belong in the canon end? And there was a letter written, it's an Easter letter in 367 AD. That is the final, that is the first and viewed as the formal listing of the 27 books that we have in the New Testament. So some people say the canon wasn't closed until 367. Well, that was when we get a list that is the 27 and only the 27. But people understood the books from the apostles as being authoritative the minute they were written. So it's a tricky way to answer. So when was the canon closed? Well, it depends upon what you mean by canon. The canon was closed the instant the 21 books were written in one level. When was the canon closed? Well, when you talk about when do you have a collection of books that were used as an authoritative source? Middle of the 2nd century. When was there no longer any serious debate? 367. So it's not a real simple. People always like to ask, what if we find more? For example, what we call 1st and 2nd Corinthians is really 2nd and 4th Corinthians. We know that in 1 Corinthians, Paul had written a previous letter, and in what we call 2 Corinthians references a letter that we don't have. So our 1st and 2nd are really 2nd and 4th Corinthians. What if somebody came up with 3rd Corinthians? What if we find it? And would we include it in the canon? And I don't think it's ever going to happen. I think God preserved the books that he wanted preserved, and he lost the ones that wanted to be lost. Well, he didn't lose it, but he got rid of them. But the problem is that any book that we find would not pass the test of Catholicity, because it wouldn't have been used by the early church. So I doubt we'll ever find anything. And even if we did, I don't think the church, the evangelical church anyway, would accept it as being a valid part of the canon. Let me say something about the Old Testament Apocrypha. I wasn't going to. This is actually in chapter 13 of the book. I don't have any notes on it. Okay. I know someone who does. There are various numbers, depending upon it, whether it's the Roman Catholic canon or the Eastern Orthodox canon, what books. But basically, there's 15 books that Catholics have that Protestants don't have. Let me just read the names. Tobias, Judith, Wisdom, or Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, which also goes by the name of Sirach, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Baruch 1-5, Baruch 6, which is also called the Epistle of Jeremiah, additions to Esther, and then we have some additions to Daniel called the Prayer of Isaiah and the Song of the Three Jews. Daniel, what the Catholics call Daniel 13, we call Susanna. What the Catholics call Daniel 14, we call Bel and the Dragon. Then there's 1st and 2nd Esdras and the prayer of Manasseh. So are any of those names familiar? Okay, if you have Catholic friends, these books are in the Bible, and they're not in the Protestant Bible. So why the difference? Okay. These books were all written after Malachi. And it is believed by the Jews that the Spirit of the Lord stopped speaking after Malachi. That's why when John the Baptist shows up, everyone's so excited. It's been 400 years since God's Spirit spoke, and here's this guy. He's fulfilling the prophecy at the end of Malachi, proclaiming the coming of the Messiah, the coming of the kingdom of God. God's been silent for 400 years. Yeah, they got excited. But these books were all written after Malachi. They were, for the most part, not written in Hebrew. Now, there's a few parts of the Old Testament written in Aramaic. The rest is Hebrew. These are written in other languages, mostly in Greek, so that they really are different. And they were never accepted by Judaism. Judaism never accepted these books. But here's the problem. Do you know the Septuagint, LXX? Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And it was started in Alexandria about 250 BC. And they started with the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Very, very well-translated books. And people kept translating until you get to Jesus' time. And like the Psalms were some of the last books translated. These 15 books are in the Septuagint. In other words, when Paul traveled, his Bible was the Septuagint, which had these 15 books. That's the problem for us. Well, these books are good enough, Paul. Why are they not good enough for us? Well, they weren't good enough for Paul because he never quotes from them. Jesus never quotes from them. But they were part of, if you picked up a bunch of scrolls and you call them the Septuagint, it would have had these books as well. What happened to these books was, through the history of the church, there was political pressure to include them. So when Jerome started his Latin Vulgate, he didn't want to include them, but he was forced to by political or religious pressure. But he has said that these books are okay to read, but you can't base any theology on them. In other words, they were always viewed as a little different. But they're put in the most influential Bible in the history of the world is Jerome's Latin Vulgate. Was the Bible of the church for 1,000 years. You get to the Reformers, though, and the Reformers don't like them. They don't like them for several reasons. They don't like them, A, because they're not written in Hebrew, and there was a huge emphasis on languages in the Reformation. Number 2, Luther, Calvin, and these guys recognized that the Jews never accepted the books. And it said, well, if the Jews don't accept them into their own canon, what are we doing accepting them? But the main reason I think the Reformers didn't like them is that there were doctrines in them that the Reformers really didn't like. The Catholic Church based their doctrine of indulgences, which Luther just hated, on a passage in one of the apocryphal books. Prayers for the Dead is based on one of the verses in Maccabees, and I think there's a few others. So for those reasons, Luther did a really, really clever thing. Up until that time, these books had been interspersed all the way through the canonical Old Testament books. Luther took them all out and put them as a separate section between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And then within 100 years, publishers just dropped it out. Well, 100 years after the Reformation, you have the Council at Trent, and you have the Roman Catholic Church saying, put them back in. And that's why in a Roman Catholic Bible, they are not in a separate section. They are interspersed throughout the Old Testament because by Catholic decree, they are authoritative. But that's why Protestant Bibles are 15 books short of the Protestant Bible. Some of those books are good. Bell and the Dragon's a funny story. I certainly want to base theology in it, but it's fun to read. Maccabees gives us our history from about 150 BC, moving until the Romans came in about 64, I think. There's interesting stuff in there, but there's other stuff like Ben Sirach. Where did sin originate from, according to Paul? Adam, right? That's not fair. Eve was the one that ate. Well, evidently Adam was sitting there right there watching because she didn't have to go find him and give it to him. She turned and gave it to him. And so his sin, I would say, is as the head of the family, to allow his wife to sin. She was deceived. He knew exactly what was going on, and he allowed it. Therefore, he committed the first sin. That's an interpretive position. Ben Sirach says that sin had its origin with women. So he blames all the sin in the world on women. Paul blames it on one man, Adam. So you actually have a real issue at that point, 'cause that's a real contradiction. So I am glad that Ben Sirach is not in my Bible. Okay. So hopefully I answered some of the questions I knew were going to come. Thanks.